First World War officially ended on November 11, 1918, but peace did not bring stability. Across Europe, millions of soldiers returned home to nations that had been devastated by 4 years of relentless fighting. Entire economies had been exhausted. Governments struggled to rebuild, and countless families mourned the loss of fathers, sons, and brothers who would never return. While the guns had fallen silent, the political and economic consequences of the war were only beginning to unfold. Among the defeated nations, Germany faced the greatest uncertainty. In 1919, representatives of the victorious Allied powers gathered outside Paris to negotiate what would become the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty required Germany to accept responsibility for the war, surrender territory, reduce the size of its military, and pay enormous financial reparations. Many Germans viewed these conditions as deeply humiliating. Whether justified or not, the treaty became a lasting source of resentment and political division within the country. The years that followed proved extraordinarily difficult. Inflation spiraled out of control. Savings lost their value almost overnight, and unemployment climbed to alarming levels. Families who had once lived comfortably suddenly found themselves unable to afford basic necessities. Political violence erupted in the streets as extremist groups from both the far left and the far right fought for influence. Confidence in Germany's young democratic government weakened with every passing year. It was during this period of instability that a small political movement known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, began attracting attention. Its leader, Adolf Hitler, was a former soldier who possessed an exceptional ability to speak before large crowds. His speeches appealed to frustration, anger, and fear, promising national renewal while blaming Germany's problems on political opponents, conspiracy theories, and minority groups, particularly Jewish people. Historians have shown that these claims were based on falsehoods, prejudice, and deliberate propaganda rather than evidence. As Germany entered the 1930s, the global Great Depression intensified the crisis. Businesses collapsed, banks failed, and millions of people lost their jobs. Economic hardship created fertile ground for radical political movements across Europe. Many voters, desperate for stability, began supporting parties that promised dramatic solutions. In the elections of the early 1930s, the Nazi Party rapidly increased its share of the vote. Although it never won an outright majority, it became one of the largest political forces in Germany. On January 30, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor. Some conservative politicians believed they could control him within a coalition government. They would soon discover they had made a profound miscalculation. Only weeks later, the Reichstag building, home to the German parliament, caught fire. The Nazi government used the incident to justify sweeping emergency measures. Civil liberties were suspended, political opponents were arrested, newspapers were censored, and democratic protections were steadily dismantled. Within months, Germany had effectively become a one-party dictatorship. From that point forward, power became increasingly concentrated in Hitler's hands. Independent political parties were banned, trade unions were dissolved, and state institutions were brought under Nazi control. Through an extensive propaganda network led by Joseph Goebbels, the regime sought to shape public opinion, glorify the government, and silence criticism. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, films, education, and mass rallies were carefully coordinated to promote Nazi ideology throughout German society. Yet behind the carefully staged public image, the government was preparing for something far greater than domestic political control. Military spending increased rapidly despite restrictions imposed after the First World War. New weapons were developed, armed forces expanded, and German industry shifted toward large-scale rearmament. Across Europe, neighboring countries watched these developments with growing concern, uncertain whether another major war could still be avoided. By the late 1930s, the balance established after the First World War was beginning to collapse. Diplomatic agreements grew increasingly fragile, international tensions intensified, and Europe found itself moving toward a crisis that would soon engulf the entire world. The events of 1938 and 1939 would transform political confrontation into open war, marking the beginning of the deadliest conflict in human history. In March 1938, German forces entered Austria in an event known as the Anschluss. The annexation took place with little military resistance, and Austria was incorporated into Nazi Germany. Later that year, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, demanding control of the Sudetenland, a border region with a large ethnic German population. European leaders, desperate to avoid another devastating war, gathered in Munich to negotiate. The resulting Munich Agreement allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's promise that he would make no further territorial demands. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home declaring that the agreement had secured peace for our time. History would prove otherwise. Only months later, in March 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, breaking the promises made in Munich. It became increasingly clear that Nazi Germany's ambitions extended far beyond revising the Treaty of Versailles. Across Europe, governments accelerated military preparations, fearing that another conflict had become inevitable. On August 23, 1939, the world was stunned by the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Although the two governments were ideological enemies, the agreement included a non-aggression pact and secret protocols dividing parts of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The pact removed the immediate risk of a two-front war for Germany and cleared the way for the next phase of Hitler's expansion. At dawn on September 1, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border. The invasion combined fast-moving armored divisions, motorized infantry, artillery, and air power in a strategy that became known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Polish defenses fought with determination but were overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of the German assault. Just 2 days later, on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had officially begun. During the first months of the conflict, fighting on the Western Front remained relatively limited, a period sometimes referred to as the Phony War. Behind the scenes, however, both sides prepared for much larger operations. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, securing strategic ports and access to vital resources. The campaign demonstrated once again the effectiveness of rapid, coordinated attacks. The following month, German forces launched a massive offensive through the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Many Allied commanders expected the main attack to resemble the trench warfare of the First World War. Instead, German armored divisions pushed through the Ardennes Forest, a region many believed was unsuitable for large-scale mechanized warfare. The surprise maneuver split Allied defenses and allowed German forces to advance toward the English Channel. Hundreds of thousands of British, French, and Belgian soldiers became trapped near the French port of Dunkirk in one of the most remarkable evacuation operations in military history. More than 330,000 Allied troops were rescued and transported across the English Channel by a combination of naval vessels and hundreds of civilian boats. Although much of their heavy equipment had to be abandoned, The evacuation preserved the core of Britain's army and allowed the fight to continue. On June 14, 1940, German troops entered Paris. Just days later, France requested an armistice. One of Europe's most powerful military nations had fallen in only 6 weeks, shocking governments around the world. Adolf Hitler now controlled much of continental Europe, while Britain stood largely alone against Nazi Germany. Confident that Britain might soon negotiate peace, Hitler instead encountered determined resistance from Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the British people. Before any invasion could take place, Germany needed control of the skies. The result was the Battle of Britain, the first major military campaign fought almost entirely by air. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1940, the German Luftwaffe launched repeated bombing raids against airfields, factories, ports, and eventually, British cities. The Royal Air Force, supported by radar technology, effective command systems, and extraordinary determination from its pilots and ground crews, successfully prevented Germany from achieving air superiority. The failure of the Luftwaffe forced Hitler to postpone and ultimately abandon plans to invade Britain. It marked Germany's first major strategic setback and demonstrated that the seemingly unstoppable expansion of the Third Reich could be resisted. Yet while the air war continued over Britain, Hitler was already planning an even more ambitious campaign. In the east lay the Soviet Union, a nation of immense size and resources. Despite the non-aggression pact signed less than 2 years earlier, preparations were underway for an invasion that would On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. More than 3 million German and Axis troops crossed the Soviet border along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse within months, allowing Germany to seize vast territories, resources, and what Nazi ideology described as living space for the German people. In the opening weeks, the German advance was astonishingly rapid. Soviet armies were surrounded, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured, and entire regions fell under German control. Cities such as Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev suffered devastating losses. Many German commanders believed victory was close, but the Soviet Union was far larger and more resilient than Nazi planners had expected. Soviet factories were dismantled and moved east beyond the reach of German bombers. New armies were raised, and the harsh realities of distance, supply shortages, and brutal weather began to slow the German advance. By the autumn of 1941, German forces approached Moscow, but exhausted troops, inadequate winter equipment, and fierce Soviet resistance halted the offensive. In December, a massive Soviet counterattack pushed the Germans back from the outskirts of the capital. The failure to capture Moscow marked a turning point. Germany now faced a long war of attrition against an enemy with enormous manpower and industrial potential. Meanwhile, another event was about to transform the conflict into a truly global war. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan. Shortly afterward, Germany declared war on the United States, bringing the world's greatest industrial power directly into the conflict. By 1942, the war stretched across Europe, North Africa, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Pacific. German forces pushed deep into the Soviet Union and advanced toward the oil-rich Caucasus region. The city of Stalingrad became the focal point of one of the most brutal battles in history. Fighting in Stalingrad raged street by street, building by building, and sometimes room by room. Civilians trapped inside the city endured starvation, bombardment, and constant danger. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, encircling the German Sixth Army. Despite opportunities to withdraw, Hitler ordered the army to hold its position. Cut off from supplies and facing the Russian winter, the trapped German forces slowly collapsed. On February 2, 1943, the remaining defenders surrendered. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. For the first time, an entire major German army had been destroyed. From that point onward, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front gradually shifted to the Soviet Union. At the same time, the Allies were gaining momentum elsewhere. In North Africa, British and American forces defeated Axis armies under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The victory opened the way for the invasion of Sicily and later mainland Italy. In July 1943, Allied troops landed in Sicily, and within weeks the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini collapsed. As the military situation worsened, the darker reality of Nazi rule became increasingly visible. Across occupied Europe, the regime carried out systematic persecution, deportation, forced labor, and mass murder. The Holocaust, the organized extermination of 6 million Jews, was conducted through ghettos, shootings, deportations, and death camps, such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor. Millions of other victims, including Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and others targeted by the regime, also suffered under Nazi persecution. These crimes became one of the defining horrors of the 20th century and remain central to understanding the true nature of the Nazi regime. By 1944, Germany faced mounting pressure on every front. In the East, the Soviet Red Army was advancing relentlessly. In the West, the Allies prepared for the operation that would open a new front in occupied France. The balance of the war had changed dramatically, and the final phase of the conflict was approaching. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, better known as D-Day. More than 150,000 American, British, Canadian, and Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history. Despite heavy casualties, the landing succeeded, opening a new front in Western Europe and forcing Germany to fight on both East and West. As Allied forces advanced through France, the Soviet Red Army continued its massive offensive from the east. German troops were steadily pushed back, losing territory, equipment, and experienced soldiers. The war had clearly turned against Nazi Germany. Inside Germany, confidence in Hitler was fading. On July 20, 1944, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate him by placing a bomb during a military meeting. The explosion killed several people, but Hitler survived with minor injuries. He responded by launching a brutal crackdown, and thousands of suspected opponents were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. Allied bombers had devastated many major cities. Transportation networks were failing. Factories could no longer meet military demands, and fuel shortages crippled the German army. Civilians faced hunger, destruction, and constant air raids. In April 1945, Soviet forces entered Berlin. Street by street, the Red Army fought its way toward the city center while German defenses crumbled. Hitler remained inside the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, refusing to leave the capital even as defeat became unavoidable. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler died in the bunker as Soviet troops closed in. The following days saw the complete collapse of Nazi Germany. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered, bringing the war in Europe to an end. The Second World War became the deadliest conflict in human history. More than 60 million people lost their lives, including soldiers and civilians from every corner of the world. Entire cities were destroyed, millions were displaced, and the Holocaust exposed the horrific consequences of racism, dictatorship, and systematic hatred. The war permanently changed global politics. The United Nations was established to promote international cooperation and reduce the risk of another world war. Germany was divided into occupation zones. Europe entered the Cold War era, and the balance of global power shifted dramatically. Today, historians continue to study the rise and fall of Nazi Germany, not to glorify its leaders, but to understand how democratic institutions can erode, how propaganda can influence societies, and how prejudice and authoritarianism can lead to catastrophic human suffering. The history of the Second World War remains a warning that the choices made during times of crisis can shape the future of the entire world. After Germany's surrender, Europe faced destruction on a scale few could have imagined. Thousands of towns and cities had been reduced to rubble. Railways, bridges, factories, and homes lay in ruins. Millions of families searched for missing relatives, while refugees traveled across the continent hoping to find safety and rebuild their lives. The full extent of Nazi crimes also became impossible to ignore. As Allied forces liberated concentration and extermination camps, the world witnessed overwhelming evidence of systematic persecution and mass murder. Survivors shared accounts of starvation, forced labor, medical experiments, and the loss of entire families. These discoveries shocked the international community and fundamentally changed how the world understood the war. In November 1945, leading Nazi officials were brought before an international military tribunal in the city of Nuremberg. The trials established an important legal precedent by holding political and military leaders personally responsible for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace. Some defendants were sentenced to death, others received prison terms, while several were acquitted based on the evidence presented. The proceedings helped shape the development of modern international criminal law. The war also transformed the global balance of power. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's two dominant superpowers. Their growing rivalry soon developed into the Cold War, a decades-long political, military, and ideological confrontation that influenced international affairs for nearly half a century. Germany itself was divided into occupation zones controlled by the Allied powers. In time, these zones became two separate states, West Germany and East Germany. The city of Berlin, despite lying deep inside East Germany, was also divided, eventually becoming one of the most visible symbols of the Cold War. The lessons of the Second World War continue to influence international politics today. Governments, historians, and educators study the conflict to better understand how economic crises, political instability, propaganda, and authoritarian rule can threaten democratic societies. Remembering the past is not only about honoring those who suffered, but also about recognizing the warning signs that history has revealed. More than 8 decades later, the Second World War remains one of the most extensively researched events in human history. New documents continue to be examined, personal testimonies are preserved, and historians still debate many strategic decisions made during the conflict. Yet one conclusion remains widely accepted. The war demonstrated the devastating consequences of dictatorship, hatred, and unchecked aggression. It also showed the importance of international cooperation, accountability, and the protection of human rights. These lessons remain as relevant today as they were in 1945, reminding future generations that understanding history is essential if humanity hopes to avoid repeating its darkest chapters. The end of the fighting did not erase the scars left by the war. Across Europe, rebuilding would take decades. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared, industries had been destroyed, and millions of children had grown up knowing only conflict. Governments faced the enormous challenge of restoring economies, rebuilding infrastructure, and helping displaced families return to normal life. International aid, including the Marshall Plan, played a major role in supporting the recovery of many Western European countries, while Eastern Europe came under increasing Soviet influence. One of the most significant outcomes of the war was the creation of the United Nations in October 1945. Founded with the goal of promoting international cooperation and preventing future global conflicts, the organization brought together countries from around the world to seek peaceful solutions to international disputes. Although it has faced many challenges throughout its history, the United Nations remains one of the most important institutions created in the aftermath of the war. Germany's division soon became one of the defining symbols of the New World Order. The Western occupation zones developed into the Federal Republic of Germany, while the Soviet-controlled Eastern Zone became the German Democratic Republic. Berlin, divided between East and West, stood at the center of growing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was built, physically separating families and communities for nearly 3 decades, until its fall in 1989 became a powerful symbol of the end of the Cold War. The legacy of the Second World War extends far beyond military history. Advances in technology, medicine, aviation, and communications accelerated during the conflict, while new international laws sought to strengthen the protection of civilians and human rights. At the same time, museums, memorials, and historical archives around the world continue to preserve the stories of those who experienced the war firsthand, ensuring that future generations can learn from their experiences. Today, historians continue to examine newly discovered documents, personal diaries, military records, and eyewitness accounts. Each new source adds another piece to the complex story of the conflict, reminding us that history is rarely simple. Decisions made by political leaders affected millions of ordinary people, whose lives were changed forever by events beyond their control. The Second World War remains a reminder of both humanity's capacity for destruction and its ability to rebuild. It demonstrated the dangers of dictatorship, aggressive expansion, racism, and political extremism, while also showing the resilience of people determined to restore peace after unimaginable suffering. More than 80 years later, its lessons continue to shape diplomacy, international law, and global cooperation. Understanding this history is not only about remembering the past, it is about protecting the future and ensuring that the mistakes of one generation are never repeated by the next.